So it's fascinating. It's one of the few descriptions of congregational formation which refers to an actual vote. And of course, it explicitly indicates that women who were members of the church voted for you, Peter, and Rotterdam. You can only wonder how unusual this was. We don't have any other examples that I know of. But there is also no official statement along the lines of women are not allowed to vote for the pastor. We assume they didn't in most churches. Certainly the lay men did. Well, aside from these processes of church formation, we can identify various other forms of significant lay involvement in the practice of the early congregational churches. One of these was lay prophesying, an example of which I opened this talk with. The idea that members of the congregation could get up and question or offer their own views on something they had just heard in a sermon. Central to this practice was the belief that lay believers might have insights the equal of any church leader. The Pilgrim pastor, John Robinson, pointed out, quote, "They who prophesy at one time may learn at another. It is the disease of the exalted clergy," one of which he was, "to scorn to learn anything of others than themselves, and almost of one another." In the lay Pilgrim church, prophesying was normally conducted after the sermon by laymen approved by the congregation to do so, and with their contributions moderated and commented upon by the elders. Jeremy Banks, whose study of Robinson's church is the most thorough, has concluded that lay prophesying was one of the elements that made the religious life of the Pilgrims exciting. Robinson emphasized that interpreting the Bible was not a skill restricted to the clergy, and that among the laymen of any proper congregation, it should be expected that some could be found whose word should be heard. It may come so to pass, Robinson wrote, that some in the church, though no ministers, may excel the very pastors themselves. William Brewster and Robert Cushman were among the lay members of the Leyden congregation whose views were highly regarded. Robinson even went so far as to, quote, "find a general rule that at times women should legitimately speak to the church, in contrast to the particular contradictory instance when the Apostle Paul wanted women to be silent." And Robinson cited scriptural precedents that included Miriam, Deborah, Huda, and Anna. Citing 1 Corinthians 13:34, Robinson wrote that it seems most plain that he had no eye nor respect at all to these extraordinary gifts and endowments of prophecy, authorizing even women furnished with them to speak publicly and in men's presence. Prophesying was, in effect, a form of preaching. And this can be analyzed as another form of lay involvement in religious affairs that is neglected in many studies. A few examples from New England may suffice. For most of the 1620s, the Plymouth church was without a settled minister, and the lay elder William Brewster led religious services, preaching and leading the congregation and singing the psalms. John Winthrop's famous Christian charity sermon to those joining him on the voyage to America in 1630 was a lay sermon. Early in 1631, Boston's Pastor John Wilson was planning to return to England to fetch his wife and settle various other business affairs. In the end, Wilson would be absent from the Boston church for 13 months, and this was before John Cotton had come to America. Addressing the church before he left, according to Winthrop's journal, Wilson prayed, and he exhorted the congregation to love, etc., and commended to them the exercise of prophecy in his absence, and designed those he thought most fit for it, namely the governor, John Winthrop, Mr. Thomas Dudley, and Mr. Increase Noble. For well over a year, these men, and possibly others, assumed the responsibility of nurturing the faith of the church. It was also a common feature of the colony's early life for a layman to preach to a gathering of saints before a congregation was formed in a town. Sometimes a visitor from elsewhere would be invited to preach. So in 1633, a group of settlers, including John Winthrop Jr., moved to the north of Boston and settled the town of Agawam, soon renamed Ipswich. The new community struggled to find a minister and relied on prophesying by its members. In the following spring, John Winthrop, as he explained in his journal, went on foot to Agawam, and because the people there lacked a minister, spent the Sabbath with them and exercised by way of prophecy. According to Thomas Letcher, who lived in Massachusetts from 1638 to 41, where farms of villages are, scattered areas, as at Rumney Marsh and Marblehead, where there is no minister, a brother of one of the congregation of Boston from Marsh and of Salem from Marblehead preacheth and exerciseth prayer every Lord's Day, which is called prophesying in such a place. The so-called conversion narratives, which I believe have been erroneously looked upon solely as requirements for church membership, were actually a way in which lay believers could share their religious experience for evangelical purposes. Sharing edifying experiences was an important part of the religious life of many churches, whether or not they may have also influenced membership decisions. Once the New Haven Church was gathered, regular, informal Thursday meetings of church members to discuss and reinforce one another's faith became a venue for such sharing of experience. John Davenport, the pastor of that church, believed that exchanging stories of how God worked in one's soul was an important factor in the ongoing communion of local saints. In a manuscript, Whole Body of Divinity, Hartford Samuel Stone indicated that those who were able might, on occasion, speak of, as he put it, the frame of grace in their hearts. But Stone made the point that such an exercise was to enrich the church, not to gain admission to it. Many saw such sharing as a duty. William Hook, John Davenport's colleague for a time in the New Haven pulpit, expressed as much after he returned to England. There is a duty incumbent upon those who were saved, he wrote, as touching the transmission of the truth to the generation to come. You have heard much, and seen much, and known much, and treasured up experiences, and therefore, certainly, you should have much to say to such as are of the younger sort. Writing at the close of the 17th century, one of the first founders of New England, Joshua Scott Adams, recalled how in the early days of settlement, laymen and laywomen shared their soul experiences each to other, and found lively characters of the same grace, line for line appearing, as in those who made partakers of the same seal in the Spirit.